The katanas are one of the more popular weapon classes in Elden Ring, and for very good reason. They have nice range, very quick movesets, good variety with their movesets, amazing weapon skill options, all get passive bleed, and they're just very easy to use as well. They are going to be comparable to things like straight swords and curved swords in terms of things like being quick dexterity based options. And on average, I tend to prefer katanas a bit more when it comes to like one-handed or two-handed movesets, but when it comes to power stancing, I don't typically like katanas as much, because the movesets don't hit simultaneously and they're going to have longer animations. And it's to the point where just using it one-handed or two-handed is just going to be much quicker, more reliable, sometimes even proc bleed faster as well. But they're still going to be very viable. Now for today, we are going to rank all 10 of them from worst to best, based on how well they perform and how useful they are in PvE. I was going to include the great katanas into this video, but I decided against it and I'll produce the great katanas at a later date. But yes, with that out the way, let's just get started. Starting off at the bottom, the Meteoric Ore Blade, which is probably the most useless katana in the entire series. This thing has basically nothing good going for it. It is the shortest katana in the game, but it also is the heaviest katana. Does get a strength and intelligence based scaling, does scale a lot better off that strength stat, but compared to all the other katanas that can be infused with a strength based scaling, they're just going to get more damage, and even with magic infusions, they're just going to outperform them too. The strength and intelligence based build format is not going to be that crazy good, because there's no staff for that particular build type. Now this weapon actually cannot be infused, but it doesn't even get a unique skill, as it does get stuck with gravitas, which one isn't even that good of a skill due to its very short range and pretty poor damage. But even if you did like to use a skill, you're better off just putting it on an UCHIGATANA or a NAGAKIBA with a magic infusion, because that's just going to get better scalings and just more damage. Now the only thing unique going for the Meteoric Ore Blade is going to be its heavy attack, which is like that Ichimonji downward slam from Sekiro. It is a pretty cool animation, but the thing is, one, it does less damage than all of the other katana heavy attacks, like the motion values are just literally lower, but the trade-off being is that it is a little bit quicker, but it's not that noticeable. And I'd never really care to use it because it gets the exact same stance damage as all the other katana heavy attacks, and it's a downward chop. I already get downward chops with my light attack combos. Why would I need another one with the heavy attack? It just removes the variety out of the moveset. I'd much rather just have access to that poking attack that you get with the katana heavies, a lot more than I would with this downward slam. The funny thing is that this heavy attack should have been the skill instead. Imagine if this attack was like some cool gravity based skill that summoned this little like purple AoE, did some really good stance damage, had some hyper armor. It would have been such a cool weapon to use. But unfortunately, we get stuck with a bunch of mid. Number 9, the SERPENTBONE Blade, which this weapon could have easily been an S tier if it could just be infused, but unfortunately, it cannot be, and I don't know why they haven't even changed it since the release, because this weapon does require smithing stones, but yeah, this can't be infused and it gets stuck with double slash skill, which is not a bad skill to have, but obviously it's not unique. Now the weapon is actually just a pure dexterity based katana, and actually can get some pretty decent damage, can even actually outdamage the UCHIGATANA with a keen infusion, but that one can be buffed and this one cannot be. Now the SERPENTBONE Blade actually is unique in the fact that it gets poison instead of bleed, which bleed is obviously the better status effect, but poison can be pretty useful with some types of builds, especially because this one is deadly poison, which ticks for a lot faster than the regular poison but doesn't last as long, which is perfectly fine because it makes it have good synergy with the poison types of buffs. It also does get the unique heavy attack of a cool little double swipe, which since the recent patch has actually been improved to be a lot faster. Now this heavy attack is really cool, but the thing is this skill already gets a double swiping attack, so kind of just feels counterintuitive and you just lose out on just having like a nice poking attack option. And all of this would have been fixed if it could be infused. Like imagine just having this infused with Cracked Blade into an occult infusion, getting so much poison build up, and getting insane damage with your heavy attacks, because this heavy attack can just outdamage all the other ones. Like it would have been so cool. But unfortunately, From Software just like completely forgot about this weapon and didn't really care for us to have fun with it. Number 8, the Starline Sword, which is one of the new ones from the DLC, and I don't even know why this one has to exist. Like we now have 4 like split magic based katanas in this game, 3 of them scaling off the intelligence stat, and we haven't had a single faith based katana at all in this game or any of the other Souls games. It would have been so much better if this was like a lightning based katana with a faith based scaling, but instead it's another magic katana with a dexterity and intelligence based scaling, so it has to compete with the Moonveil, which it's never going to beat the Moonveil, because that one can just get a lot more damage and just have a much better skill, because yeah, this thing does get a pretty decent dexterity scaling, but only gets a descaling in intelligence. Now thankfully the skill does scale off AR, so just going all into dexterity can just boost the damage of it, but the thing is the damage is still not that good. It can help stun lock smaller types of enemies with the entire skill combo, and actually can perform somewhat similar to things like double slash or like the Rivers of Blood skill, that it extends the range and it does like a nice 3-part combo. But there are some things about the Starline Sword I don't really care for. The first couple swings are okay, but once you get to like the third and the fourth swing, there's like a little bit of a delay that you can get staggered out of. And also when you get to like the final spinning attack, for some reason this attack does like just as much damage as like the entire first part of the combo, but it takes forever to get there. And you actually do become partly invisible, but this animation doesn't actually get any iframes for some reason. Like the entire combo can be pretty nice, but you could just do just as much damage with this entire combo than you could with like a couple of Moonveil attacks, and it'll consume just as much FP and just do it in a much quicker time. Like the weapon looks really cool and flashy, and is still very viable, but it's basically outclassed by so many different things in this game, and I would have liked it a lot more if it was like a faith-based katana instead. Now in terms of how I would buff the weapon, the skill could definitely use with a speed increase with like that second and third part. It definitely needs iframes for that last part as well, and probably just let it have like a better intelligence scaling. That would be nice, but even then, if all those things were to happen, I still wouldn't really care to use it over the Moonveil. Number 7, the Dragonscale Blade, which is another dexterity-based katana that cannot be infused. This is actually the only katana that actually doesn't come with a passive status effect via the weapon itself, but actually does gain some frost build-up when you use this skill. Now, the skill itself is like a reskinned version of Lightning Slash. It's not going to be that high damaging. It is a pretty short range with no hyper armor, but the whole purpose is to just boost the weapon with just some more lightning damage and more frost damage, which this is actually a very decent buff. It boosted by a whole bunch more, and it turns it from being like one of the worst damaging katanas in the game to probably one of the higher damaging katanas. Now the thing is, it still is only 80 frost build-up. If you just went with like a regular Uchigatana or a Nagakiba with like a cold infusion, it's going to get you like over 100 frost build-up and also give you some passive bleed. I would have liked for this weapon to just also retain bleed while just having frost, because honestly it wouldn't have been that broken. So the katana overall can just get some okay amount of damage. It can get some frost build-up. The weapon also does get some bonus damage against some dragons as well, which is pretty cool. I feel like I would have liked this weapon a lot more if it just had that passive bleed as I mentioned, and it has had a different type of skill, because this weapon is very comparable to the dragon halberd, and that it is a pure physical weapon that can be buffed with some frost lightning, but that one, it has like a much harder hitting skill and can be buffed for cheaper in a quicker animation. I feel like I would have valued this a lot more if it had like a lightning version of Flaming Strike instead of being like a reskinned version of Lightning Slash. So it's like a decent katana overall, but it just misses a few things in my opinion. Number 6, the Rivers of Blood, which yes is one of the more popular weapons, if not the most popular weapon in the entire game. Yes, it has gotten nerfed a long time ago, but I feel like people are now like in two separate camps. There's like one that swear by this is like the best weapon in the entire game, and there are other people that swear that this thing has gotten nerfed to the ground, when in fact it actually is a very decent katana that might be outclassed by other weapons, but it does have enough going for it to still be a very solid A tier. Now the weapon does get a nice dexterity and arcane based scaling, does scale a lot better off that arcane stat, so just going all into it is going to benefit you of more damage and obviously more blood loss build up, alongside having good synergy with the Dragon Communion Seal. Now the AR of the weapon can get pretty high, but it still is split fire damage, so going with like an occult infused Nagakiba or an Uchigatana with the same build and same stats, those weapons can just output more damage. Now the skill of the Rivers of Blood Corpse Piler is like a reskinned version of Double Slash. Basically it is the exact same animation. Now the difference is that Corpse Piler does actually leave an extended projectile part. It actually does like extend the weapon by like 3 times the amount. Now this projectile part obviously doesn't do anywhere near as much damage or anywhere near as much blood loss build up as hitting with the weapon directly, but it still is like some nice chip damage at a distance that can perform pretty well. Now the thing is, if you are using things like Double Slash on a Nagakiba and going into like a high arcane occult infusion, it can just do more damage, it can do more blood loss build up, it is going to consume like a third amount of the FP, and obviously that weapon can be infused, so you can go back and forth between different types of skills. Now as of the DLC, there is actually the existence of the Arnsbark set, and this actually does boost the skill of the Rivers of Blood, but doesn't actually boost Double Slash, and it actually is a 14% damage boost, and included with this, it actually does make it do a little bit more damage than a Nagakiba Double Slash. However, if you do put on things like the Rakshasa armor set and the White Mask, which is going to be like the optimal like armor set for a lot of bleed weapons, the Nagakiba and definitely the Uchigatana are just going to do more damage, especially if you are surrounded by water or if you're in the rain or even fighting enemies resistant fire damage, which there are a lot in this game. The Rivers of Blood is going to suffer a downside in that area too. So basically the main reason to use the Rivers of Blood is to just have a projectile option and also just have a weapon that's easier to upgrade too. But in almost every other instance, I'd just rather use things like the Uchigatana or Nagakiba and then switch back and forth between a bunch of different skills. It's not going to be as easy to upgrade because obviously it requires smithing stones, but you can get it a lot earlier in the playthrough, and it's just going to perform better in my opinion. At number 5, we have the Hand of Millennia, and at number 4, we have the Sword of Night. Now, I normally don't talk about two weapons at the same time, but these ones do perform very similar, and I kind of want to compare them side by side. Now, they are both pure dexterity types of katanas, both get passive bleed, both are required towards the end of the game, one of them being in the DLC, and they both do get a very similar skill that can hit many times in quick succession, stun lock enemies pretty well, and just do some nice overall damage. Now, the Hand of Millennia is going to have a bit more range, for roughly the same amount of weight, and also get a bit better damage. The Sword of Night does get higher AR, but some of it is actually split magic damage, so in most cases, the Hand of Millennia is just going to straight up out-damage it, which with the dexterity build, nothing else out-damages the Hand of Millennia anyway, unless you do include like weapon buffs. Now, in terms of their moveset, the Sword of Night does get the same heavy attack as a Serpentbone Blade in that cool double swiping attack, which as I mentioned is going to do more damage than all the other heavy attacks, and as of the recent patch, it actually does come out very fast now. Now, the problem that I have with this heavy attack with this weapon in particular is that the weapon skill already does get a nice sideward swiping attack that can stun lock enemies. I like to have my moveset complement the skill, and this one just kind of clashes with it instead. This weapon would have benefited much more just having like the regular poking attack heavy, but unfortunately there actually is no poking heavy attack with this katana. Now, as for the skills themselves, I do prefer Witching Hour Slash over Waterfowl Dance, but they both do have their pros and cons. Now, Witching Hour Slash is a nice 3-hit combo, whereas Hand of Millennia is actually a 4-hit combo. Sword of Night does get a bit more bleed build-up, and actually is going to be a bit more expensive. And Hand of Millennia, with its 4-hit combo, is going to have better synergy with the multi-hit talismans. It also is going to get a bit more damage, but it does have a longer animation, and it consumes a lot more stamina. Now, the Hand of Millennia actually does get the option of follow-up attacks. You can get a second and a third additional input, and these don't consume much FP at all, and getting the entire combo off can result in very high amounts of damage. Now, this is obviously going to be better against enemies that can be staggered, because against enemies that cannot be staggered, it's probably not going to go very well. It's a long animation and very high stamina cost, so it does make the skill very situational, which is kind of why I like the Sword of Night a bit more. It doesn't actually get any follow-up inputs, but the skill does come out pretty fast, and it does have the option of a charged version as well, which this charged version does actually make it do more damage and make it do more stance damage than the Hand of Millennia, all while also getting a bit more bleed buildup. Even if you do include all the multi-hit talismans that are probably going to work better with the Hand of Millennia, the Godfrey's icon just like pushes this above way further. Now, when fully charged, the starting animation might be a bit longer, but it does actually lunge in pretty nicely, which I think is like the most underrated part about the skill. You can like wait for an enemy's combo to finish and just lunge in as they finish their animation, and it can make for one of the more satisfying types of skills to use. It is like my personal favorite katana in the entire game for that exact reason. It makes it have a very high skill ceiling and makes it good and viable in every single boss fight. I did like an entire playthrough using just the Sword of Night skill, and my entire playthrough was extremely easy, whereas I did a playthrough with the Waterfowl Dance only, and I cannot say the same. It is a lot more situational. Even though Hand of Millennia can stun lock better and is a lot more FP efficient, I think the stamina cost, also the inability to delay the follow-up attacks, you have to like use them instantly, otherwise it will just end the combo, just make me gravitate more towards the Sword of Night. Even though it does get a little bit less range, less damage, and a slightly worse moveset in my opinion, I just think the skill can be just used universally, so I'd consider it to be the better option. As number 3, the UCHIGATANA, which is the highest damaging katana in the entire game, and you can acquire it right at the beginning. It has low requirements, doesn't weigh very much, and it is one of 2 infusible katanas, and katanas can get amazing weapon skill options, especially things like Unsheath, which is like one of the best skills in the entire game, and as of the recent patch, it just gotten even better because of things like the Rolana's cameo. Now, I still think that the NAGAKIBA is like the direct upgrade to this weapon. Even though it does get a little bit less damage, it just gets the better moveset with its heavy attack pokes both one-handed and two-handed, and it just gets much more range. Now, normally when I do consider something directly outclassed, I still wouldn't put it into the S tier, but for the UCHIGATANA's sake, I still think it's useful enough for it to be considered an S tier, because there are some people out there that don't really care much about the range and just want to have damage, which the UCHIGATANA is going to be that option for you. And I think its extremely low requirements compared to the NAGAKIBA is going to be the biggest difference too, because NAGAKIBA gets a 22 dexterity requirement and an 18 strength requirement. So if you actually wanted to go with like an occult infusion and go high into arcane, or go pair it with a magic or a faith type of build, you're going to have a lot of stats that you have to spec into just to wield the NAGAKIBA, whereas it's going to be a lot more efficient, and you're probably going to end up saving about 10 extra points if you just went with the UCHIGATANA instead, and also there's benefit of more damage. And there's 22 points that you would put into dexterity with the NAGAKIBA, you could just put those into things like health instead. So although I don't personally consider it to be the best katana in the game, I could see why somebody would. Number 2, the Moonveil Katana. Now, it is actually a nice dexterity and intelligence-based katana. Does scale a lot better off that intelligence stat, and its skill also does mainly scale off that too, so just going all into it is just going to be the best option. Now, even with these magic types of builds, it's probably still not going to outdamage things like the NAGAKIBA or the UCHIGATANA, but it still is going to be very useful for a couple of reasons. One, it actually is going to be an early Sombra-based weapon, so it's very easy to upgrade, and obviously its skill is just insane. It is just a reskinned version of Unsheath, works the exact same way, but it just turns it into a magic projectile instead. Now, I actually did just touch on Unsheath and compare it to the Moonveil skill Transient Moonlight in one of my recent videos, where I actually ranked all the different types of stance skills. So I'm not going to really go into detail again, but if you did want like a TLDR, the Unsheath skill actually does do more damage. It also does do the same stance damage with the heavy attack, but as for the light attack version, the Moonveil can actually get more stance damage, and being that it's a lot quicker, and including with things like crouch canceling, you could stance break enemies really quickly with this. And also, I think the Moonveil just gets better synergy with the Rellana's cameo, because the Moonveil skill can just be used as a projectile option. That heavy attack just goes ridiculously far, and obviously with the Rellana's cameo, you have to charge it up for a second first. Now, in most cases, when you're fighting larger bosses, you're probably still better off just like using the skill uncharged, but obviously if you have a projectile, you can set it a safer distance and then fully charge it with the Rellana's cameo, and its benefit of 45% more damage. It's such an easy to use and amazing weapon in this game that you can put it in the hands of anybody and they're just going to succeed. I think the only unfortunate thing about the weapon is that it still has to compete with things like the Wing of Estelle and the Death's Poker for an intelligence and dexterity based weapon, and it still actually is somewhat outclassed by things like the Uchigatana or NAGAKIBA with Unsheath in terms of damage. But I think its synergy with the Rellana's cameo, the distance that it actually does go, and the light attack version of the skill is enough reason for this thing to be a very high S tier and potentially even a top 10 weapon in this game. And that's number 1, the NAGAKIBA, which is one of 2 infusible katanas. Now, as I mentioned with the Uchigatana, that one actually does get more damage with basically every single infusion, but the damage difference is not that crazy. It's only about like 5 to 10 AR with almost every single infusion, but one big difference is going to be the range. The NAGAKIBA is like the longest katana in the game, and it's like not even close. This thing just hits at such insane distances, and it's just going to have the speed and damage of a katana. And it also does get the best moveset too, because both one-handed and two-handed is going to be a poking attack. And as of the recent patch, these uncharged heavies are just so much faster, and you can just keep spamming the uncharged heavies any single time that you actually go up against enemies like weaker to piercing damage or really resist to slashing damage. Now, as I've mentioned with infusible katanas, these get so many amazing options. Things like Bloodblade are one of the best skills in the entire game, because it can just be like a better version of the Reduvia, and putting it with the NAGAKIBA is quite literally the best option, because it can get some of the most damage and actually get some of the most range too, because it actually does get a hitbox with the weapon directly, and obviously the NAGAKIBA just gets ridiculous range. So this makes for a very broken pairing, and also the existence of Unsheath is there as well. And with the range of the NAGAKIBA, it kind of feels like you're just using a projectile with how far that it actually can lunge. Like hitting at that distance, doing like 30 stance damage while only consuming like 8 FP. And also if you have the Rellana's cameo and wait for it to fully charge, you're just doing such stupid amounts of damage too. Even though I do consider Moonveil a little bit better because it is more user friendly, and I think the range of the weapon can just cheese enemies a lot harder. But if you're a player that doesn't really care much about having a projectile, NAGAKIBA is going to be the better option by a long shot. And also it can be infused, so you have such great versatility. You can pair it alongside any single type of infusion, any single type of build, switch up your skills back and forth as well. And almost every single build that you actually try to go with this thing, whether it be charged heavy attacks, skill spamming, R1 spamming, power stance jumping attacks, it doesn't matter. Like the NAGAKIBA is like the best option for every single one of those things. Okay, that is the video completed. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. As for the next video, it is going to be the Twin Blades ranked from worst to best. I was going to do the Great Katanas, but I think I'm going to save all the DLC weapon categories for the end. I'm not sure if I actually want to make it into like one big video because there's not many different types of weapons for each category. Just let me know what you think down below. And also do follow me on Twitch because I'm live there almost every single day, doing a bunch of different types of challenge runs. So if you actually wanted to ask questions or go check me out, definitely do pop by. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.